Good evening, good Vach Shavua Tov, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. It's great to be starting the week learning some beautiful Torah with you. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Missouri, Belle in Texas, Frank in San Pedro Heim in Florida, Debbie in New Jersey, Lanit in Silver Spring, Moshe in Brooklyn, Lucy in Minnesota. Welcome, everybody. Okay, our dot today is page 11. We're picking this up right at the bottom of page 10b. And God willing, we're going to complete our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. It's not easy material. We are deriving the sort of missing elements where the Torah did not specify exact particulars of the particular offerings, right? We know about some offerings, who can bring them, when they can be brought, what happens if an aspect of them isn't done properly. And so the sages keep asking rigorously, okay, well, where those elements aren't specified with respect to other offerings, what gives us a right, so to speak, to extend the law of the burnt offering to the sin offering, or the law of the guilt offering to the peace offering, etc. And we're deriving very carefully when we can make those extensions or not make them. And maybe another way to think about this is, for nearly 2,000 years, there's this huge number of commandments that we've been unable to fulfill in the absence of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Once it was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, that was the end of bringing offerings. But by dedicating so much time and mental effort to understanding these laws, prayer replaces the offerings in our lives, but also study of the offerings. And thank God it's difficult, because it's a greater merit to anyone who engages in this study to understand the offerings. Now, what's interesting is that all these derivations that the sages are doing, the Mishnah closed in the year 200. The Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, who were arguing on the Mishnahs, that was done during the period between the year 200 and the year 500. So the temple was long gone at the time that they are deriving these laws. So how was it actually done when it was being practically done? They didn't have these rulings yet. That's how important, so there was some kind of practical answer to all those questions the Kohanim in the temple knew. Was that knowledge lost? Or had they made some assumptions, had some general practices, and they did not yet have an established system of arguing and working it out and deriving hermeneutical principles, perhaps it just hadn't been fully worked out at the time that it was being practiced. I'm sure they had practical answers to all these questions. I would hope that, 99% of the time or 100% of the time, it's squared with what the sages eventually derived. But it's just worth noting that the sages had to derive a lot of these laws long after the temple was gone. So just as they earned, eternal merit for that work, we join in that merit by continuing to learn these laws to this day. Okay, bottom of page 10b. We learned in a Mishnah elsewhere on page 81b of this tractate, as Rabbi Akiva would say, any blood that should have been sprinkled on the external altar, right? So typical offering of an animal, whether it was a goat or a sheep or a cow, and when that offering was made, right, the effective part of the offering process was that its blood was collected at the time of slaughter, conveyed to the altar, and sprinkled on the altar. And that's what affected atonement, if it was an atonement offering, or the actual gift, if it was a gift offering, etc. The effective moment was when the blood was sprinkled on the altar. And the exception to blood being sprinkled on the altar when it involved blood is on Yom Kippur, right, which is now coming up this week. when there was sprinkling of the blood of the various animals, the goats of Yom Kippur and the bull of the high priest, which was done inside the sanctuary, either on the curtain separating the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies, or even within the Holy of Holies between the staves of the Aron, of the Ark of the Covenant. That's the difference between internal sprinkling and external sprinkling. So as Rabbi Akiva would say, any blood that should have been sprinkled on the external altar, but instead entered to atone in the sanctuary, is unfit, right? Meaning this was not on Yom Kippur. This was some offering that should have had its blood sprinkled on the large altar outside the sanctuary, and for some reason somebody made a mistake, or was drunk, or did just for some reason. Probably this never happened. I can't imagine how this would have happened. But in some twilight zone, the question is, if such a thing happened, then what would be the status of the offering whose blood was supposed to be sprinkled on the altar and instead got sprinkled in a place of much higher holiness, right? Inside the sanctuary and onto the curtain of the Holy of Holies. What does it do? You might think, well, if sprinkling it on the altar completes its journey, then sprinkling it on the internal area, which is a place of higher holiness, would somehow make it even a higher offering? No, it violates the procedure, and it would render that offering unfit. Meaning, not only would it not satisfy the obligation of the owner, the person who was bringing the offering, but it would be entirely unfit at that point. If it was the type of offering, a sin offering, for example, where parts of it are eaten by the priest, they can't eat it because it has been rendered unfit by this deviation from the procedure and a violation of this prohibition. And so that was Rabbi Akiva's opinion. And the rabbis say that that is the halacha only with regard to the blood of a sin offering. Sin offering has this very specific procedure that's purpose is to achieve atonement. But if you did this with a burnt offering, it would not satisfy the obligation of its owner, but it would remain fit to complete its journey to the outer altar. Rabbi Eliezer says that the halachic status of a guilt offering is also like that of a sin offering, as it is stated, as this is the sin offering, so is the guilt offering. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying that if you were supposed to sprinkle the blood of a guilt offering on the external altar and you did it on the internal area, that it also would be rendered unfit like a sin offering. But both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer were minority opinions that were overruled. The Gemara asks, granted, the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer is understandable as he states the reason for his opinion. But what is the reason for the opinion of the rabbis, meaning the majority? So Rava said, you cannot say that the blood of a guilt offering that entered into the sanctuary is disqualified due to a kal v'chomer inference from the case of a burnt offering. How does that inference work? Just as with regard to a burnt offering, which is totally consumed by the fire on the altar, the main altar, nevertheless, even if its blood enters into the sanctuary, it would remain fit. Then, with regard to a guilt offering, which is not entirely consumed on the altar, all the more so is it not clear that even if its blood enters the sanctuary, it remains fit. So they're commenting on why would the rabbis argue with Rabbi Eliezer? It's accepted that when the rabbis overruled Rabbi Akiva, no one's arguing that Rabbi Akiva is right. The question is, why did they overrule Rabbi Eliezer? So the Gemara refutes this inference. What is notable about a burnt offering? Now we're on page 11a. It is notable that in that it does not atone for a sin, right? You bring a burnt offering either as part of a group of offerings that are mandated by a particular situation, like the end of a Nazir's vow of Naziris, or because you want to make a gift to the Lord. Praise the Lord. You're so happy. You want to show, thanksgiving and praise to the Lord. So you bring an elevation offering. Or because you vowed that you would bring an elevation offering, maybe for that purpose, but once you made that vow, then you become obligated to bring the burnt offering. But what does not do is atone for a sin, at least a violation of a negative commandment, a prohibition. So perhaps that is why its blood is not disqualified if it enters the sanctuary, whereas we just said a sin offering whose blood enters the sanctuary does disqualify the sin offering. So the Gemara responds that the meal offering of a sinner, right? So this would be a sinner who can't afford to bring a sin offering, so he brings a meal offering, right? Flour, much cheaper than an animal, can prove the point, as it is not disqualified by entering the sanctuary, even though it atones for a sin. So here it's just a given that if you bring in a meal offering into the sanctuary, that doesn't disqualify it the way sprinkling its blood inside the sanctuary would. So the Gemara interjects, but let us say that a bird sin offering, that's the intermediate level between a meal offering and an animal offering, but let us say that a bird brought as a sin offering can prove the point, as it too atones for a sin, but it is also not disqualified by entering the sanctuary. This case is more similar to that of a guilt offering, as a bird has blood, unlike a meal offering. And the Gemara answers, it is not certain that a bird sin offering is not disqualified by entering the sanctuary. This is a dilemma raised by Rabbi Avin. And the Gemara asks, okay, let's try something else. Let us refute the above response as follows. What is notable about the meal offering of a sinner? It is notable in that it is not a type of slaughtered offering, as we discussed yesterday. When a bird offering is brought, it's not shechted, it's not slaughtered with a knife across its neck. Its neck is pinched. It's a different form. The bird is killed, just like the sheep or the goat, but it's not with shechting, with slaughter. So since there's a difference in the procedure, maybe we can't learn out laws from the bird about an animal that is slaughtered. Right? You can't compare the bird sin offering to an animal guilt offering. So the Gemara answers, if so, a burnt offering can prove the point, since it is a slaughtered offering, and still its blood enters the sanctuary, and it is not disqualified. But we already said there's a difference between burnt offerings and sin offerings, in that burnt offerings are entirely consumed and they don't atone for a sin. So the inference has reverted to its starting point. The law is derived from the laws of a burnt offering and the meal offering of a sinner. If we combine those two to see what is their common element, maybe that can teach us why a guilt offering is not like a sin offering. It is not disqualified if its blood comes inside the sanctuary. The aspect of this case is not like the aspect of that case, and the aspect of that case is not like the aspect of this case. Their common element is that they are offerings of the most sacred order, and if they enter into the sanctuary, they are still fit. So too, I shall include a guilt offering and infer that since it is also an offering of the most sacred order, if its blood enters into the sanctuary, it is still fit. We'll see if the derivation works, but that is the law. Rava of Barnish said to Rav Ashi, but let us refute this inference. What is notable about their common element? It is notable in that neither a burnt offering nor the meal offering of a sinner has a fixed value. Sliding scale. You could bring a less expensive or a more expensive type of offering. Flour, bird, animal. Should you say the same laws apply to a guilt offering, which has a fixed value? There's not the sliding scale. The guilt offering is only a specific kind of animal. So rather, this is the reason for the opinion of the rabbis, as the verse states, and any sin offering, any of whose blood is brought into the tent of meeting to atone in the sanctuary, shall not be eaten. That's Leviticus 6:23. The term, whose blood, teaches that the blood of this offering, i.e. a sin offering, and not the blood of any other offering, is disqualified in this manner. If its blood enters the sanctuary, the Torah says it gets disqualified, but it's only speaking about the sin offering, and by saying only the sin offering, it excludes others. And how does the other Tana, right, the rabbis were arguing with Rabbi Eliezer, so how would Rabbi Eliezer interpret this term? Since he's not using it to teach this law, what would he do with that? He derives from it that only its blood is disqualified by entering the sanctuary, but not its flesh. That's why he would say, well, that's interesting. Is he saying that the sin offering is not rendered unfit if its blood enters the sanctuary? That's news, okay? And from where do the other rabbis derive that the flesh of a sin offering is not disqualified by entering the sanctuary? Oh, if the blood enters and is sprinkled on the inside, that disqualifies the offering entirely. But if you simply carry the sin offering inside the sanctuary and then carry it out, that didn't render it unfit. You didn't do anything with it. It just entered and then left. If you sprinkle the blood, then you performed a element of its offering procedure in the wrong manner, and that disqualifies it. So the fact that its flesh entered and left doesn't do anything. He's saying he learns that from this verse. And from where do the other rabbis derive that the flesh of a sin offering is not disqualified by entering the sanctuary? They maintain that both laws are learned from this term, as the verse could have simply stated blood, but it stated whose blood? And the redundancy excludes not only the flesh, but also other offerings. So how does Rabbi Eliezer answer this? Well, Rabbi Eliezer does not interpret the redundancy indicated by the change from blood to whose blood as significant. Once the word blood is mentioned, it is grammatically necessary for the verse to state whose blood, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Next topic. The Gemara resumes its discussion of the dispute in the Mishnah between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Rabbi Eliezer would compare the guilt offering to the sin offering and say that once, if you slaughtered it for the wrong, not for its sake, it is rendered unfit. The rabbi said that only applies to the sin offering and the Pesach. Rabbi Eliezer would say, and the guilt offering also, because guilt offerings are compared to sin offerings, right? Granted, according to the rabbis who say that a guilt offering that one slaughtered not for its sake is fit. That is why a meal offering is juxtaposed with a sin offering, and a meal offering is also juxtaposed with a guilt offering, right? Since a meal offering is juxtaposed with both of them, it has to be teaching that they're similar in some ways and different in others, right? So that one of the differences is that a guilt offering, which is slaughtered not for its sake, remains fit. Doesn't fulfill the obligation of its owner, but remains fit. That's distinguished from a sin offering. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer would say, no, a guilt offering is like a sin offering, and if you slaughter it not for its sake, it would be unfit. So now, Rabbi Eliezer is going to have to answer, well, what does he learn from the fact that the meal offering is juxtaposed to both the sin offering and the guilt offering in the Torah? All right. Now, let's stick with the rabbi's point of view. This is why the guilt offering does remain fit if it's slaughtered for the wrong sake. And this is as it is taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Shimon says, the verse states with regard to a meal offering, it is most sacred as the sin offering and as the guilt offering. That's that juxtaposition in Leviticus 6:10, teaching that a meal offering of a sinner is like a sin offering. Therefore, if one removed its handful not for its sake, it is disqualified. What they're saying is when you bring a meal offering and you actually pick up the handful of flour to bring the offering, if at that time you have the wrong intention, it's going to be disqualified. It's being compared to grabbing that handful of flour to the act of shechting the animal of the sin offering. Therefore, if one removed the handful not for its sake, it is disqualified. And the verse also teaches that a voluntary meal offering is like a guilt offering. Therefore, if one removed its handful not for its sake, it is still fit. Contrasting the meal offering of a sinner who's obligated to bring it and he's poor, so he's bringing the least expensive kind. And now talking about a meal offering that is voluntary, a voluntary meal offering, which I guess is like an inexpensive gift offering. Therefore, if you remove that handful not for its sake, wouldn't satisfy the intent that you were trying to bring, but it would still count as a gift offering. And this accords with the opinion of the rabbis that a guilt offering slaughtered not for its sake is fit. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, for what law is a meal offering juxtaposed with both a sin offering and a guilt offering? And the Gemara answers they are juxtaposed to teach the other law derived by Rabbi Shimon from this verse. As we learned in a Mishnah, Tractate Menachos 26a, if the handful of a meal offering is conveyed to the altar, but not in a service vessel, right, an official vessel, I think most of them were made of silver, that were used in the Holy Temple. If it was conveyed to the altar not in a service vessel, the offering is unfit. And Rabbi Shimon deems it fit. Right? So Rabbi Shimon says, well, the important thing is that you conveyed the amount of flour that was part of the meal offering to the altar. The rabbis who overrule him say, yeah, but there's also rules for how it's conveyed, and one of them is that it's conveyed in a service vessel. Just like we have a service vessel that's used to collect the blood of an animal offering and convey that to the altar, we have a different kind of service vessel that is used to convey the flour of a meal offering. And Rav Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, says, what is the reason of Rabbi Shimon? The verse states with regard to a meal offering, it is most sacred as the sin offering and as the guilt offering, teaching that if a priest comes to perform its sacrificial rites by hand, he must perform them with his right hand, like one performs the rites of a sin offering. And if he performs them with a vessel, he must perform them with his left hand, like one performs the rites of a guilt offering. Since Rabbi Shimon maintains this is permitted in the case of a guilt offering. So the Gemara asks for Rabbi Shimon himself, does he expound this verse for this purpose? Concerning one who, if one removes its handful not for its sake, and expounded for that purpose, concerning conveying the handful with one's hand? Is he pulling out both meanings from the same verse? And the Gemara answers, the verse comes mainly to teach that which Rav Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, explained, and the law that a meal offering of a sinner whose handful was removed not for its sake is unfit. This is actually due to another reason. What is the reason that a sin offering sacrificed not for its sake is disqualified? The reason is that the word it is written with regard to it in the verse. It is a sin offering. And since the word it is also written with regard to the meal offering of a sinner in the verse, for it is a sin offering, Leviticus 5:11, comparing to Leviticus 4:24, so the same rule applies in that case. We have a reason to extend that element of the procedure from the animal sin offering to the meal offering. In the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer cites the verse, as is the sin offering, so is the guilt offering, Leviticus 7:7. That's his reason why, if a sin offering is rendered unfit by a faulty procedure, the guilt offering should be rendered unfit for the same reason. He uses Leviticus 7:7. So the Gemara asks, and according to the rabbis, for what law is a guilt offering juxtaposed with a sin offering? Okay, if Rabbi Eliezer is wrong, and a guilt offering will remain fit if slaughtered not for its sake, unlike a sin offering, then why was the guilt offering juxtaposed to the sin offering? And the Gemara answers, they are juxtaposed to tell you that just as a sin offering requires placing hands on the head of the offering, the animal, right, sheep or goat, just as the sin offering requires placing hands, that's known as semicha, on the head of the offering, so too a guilt offering requires placing hands on the head of the offering. Take a moment to imagine that when you are obligated to bring a sin offering. The temple is standing in Jerusalem. You walk all the way to Jerusalem. Might take days. You bring this animal with you. It walks alongside you. You've designated it. You've consecrated to be your sin offering. You finally reach the temple. The day has come. You're going to go through this dramatic and majestic procedure of bringing a sin offering. And before you hand over the animal to whoever's going to slaughter it and the priest who's going to receive the blood and take it to the altar, you have one last moment with the animal where you place your hands on its head, right? Like, you acknowledge this animal is going to serve as a sin offering for me. And then it goes. It's a powerful moment. New topic. The Mishnah teaches that Yosef ben Choni says, other offerings that are slaughtered for the sake of the Pesach or a sin offering are unfit. Right? So we already said, if a Pesach or a sin offering was slaughtered not for its sake, it is disqualified, meaning it will not satisfy your obligation, and unfit, procedures cut off, it does not move forward, we don't finish the sprinkling and call it a gift offering. Now, the inverse, or converse, I forget which. What if another offering, which you wanted to bring, let's say a burnt offering, and by mistake, at the time of slaughter, you said it's for the sake of a sin offering, or for the sake of a Pesach. Then what happens to that other offering? Right, so Yosef ben Choni says other offerings that are slaughtered for the sake of a Pesach or a sin offering are unfit. Right, same consequence as in the reverse case. Rabbi Yochanan says Yosef ben Choni and Rabbi Eliezer said the same thing, i.e. Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Yosef ben Choni. Rabbah says although they agree that other offerings slaughtered for the sake of a Pesach are unfit, they disagree with regard to other offerings slaughtered for the sake of a sin offering. Whereas Yosef ben Choni holds that they are unfit, Rabbi Eliezer would say that they are fit. They remain fit in that situation. And this is as it is taught in a Baraisa in the case of a Pesach whose first year has passed. And right, because a Pesach, right, the Paschal lamb or young goat has to be brought in its first year. It has to be less than 1 year old. And when does it get slaughtered? On the afternoon before Passover begins that night. There's only one other time when you can slaughter a Pesach, and that's 1 month later, Pesach Sheni. If you couldn't bring it on Pesach because you were too far away from Jerusalem or you were Tameh, then you could bring it 1 month later at Pesach Sheni. Any other time of the year, you cannot slaughter. If you do slaughter a Pesach for the sake of a Pesach on the wrong day and time, then it is rendered unfit. You can't even eat it at all. But if you bring a Pesach, an animal you designate to be a Pesach, at the wrong time, and then you slaughter it for the sake of some other offering, then it is fit. It just becomes a gift offering. Okay, that's the general law of the Pesach. So now they taught in Baraisa. In the case of a Pesach whose first year has passed, it was designated to be a Pesach. For some reason, you didn't bring it on Passover. Let's say it was born last year between Pesach and Pesach Sheni. You weren't able to bring it on Pesach. You thought to maybe bring it on Pesach Sheni this year, but in between Pesach and Pesach Sheni, it turned 1 year. So now it's older than 1 year on Pesach Sheni. It's now disqualified to be brought as a Pesach. So in the case of a Pesach whose first year has passed, and it must therefore be sacrificed as a peace offering, and one slaughtered it at its designated time on Erev Pesach for its own sake. Let's say it was the following year you brought it. So now it wasn't designated to be a Pesach, and you slaughtered it on Erev Pesach, but now it's more than a year old. So what happens? So you slaughtered it at its designated time on Erev Pesach for its own sake as a Pesach, and likewise, if one slaughtered other offerings for the sake of a Pesach on Erev Pesach, then the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah, disagree as to the status of the offering. Rabbi Eliezer deems it unfit, and Rabbi Yehoshua deems it fit. Sounds like Rabbi Yehoshua would say, well, it should have been done while it was less than a year old, but you did everything else right, and so it remains fit. Is that going to work? Let's see. Rabbi Yehoshua said, if during the rest of the days of the year, when a Pesach is not fit, if it is slaughtered for its own sake, nevertheless other offerings that are slaughtered for its sake are fit, then at its designated time, when a Pesach is fit, if it is slaughtered for its own sake, isn't it logical that other offerings slaughtered for its sake should be fit? He's using a Kal V'chomer. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, or conversely, just as during the rest of the days of the year, when a Pesach is not fit, if it is slaughtered for its own sake, it is fit if slaughtered for the sake of other offerings. You could turn it into a peace offering. So too, at its designated time, when it is fit if slaughtered for its own sake, is it logical that it should be fit if slaughtered for the sake of other offerings? And accordingly, a Pesach slaughtered not for its own sake on the 14th of Nisan, meaning the afternoon before Pesach begins, should be deemed fit, which contradicts the law. So clearly this line of reasoning leads to incorrect conclusions. We can't use a Kal V'chomer here. We need some other kind of reasoning. So furthermore, Rabbi Eliezer refuted Rabbi Yehoshua's logic as follows. And do you say this derivation, what does it matter to me that other offerings slaughtered during the rest of the days of the year for the sake of a Pesach are deemed fit? After all, a Pesach slaughtered for the sake of other offerings is also fit. But must you say that other offerings slaughtered at its designated time for its sake should be deemed fit? After all, at its designated time, a Pesach slaughtered for the sake of other offerings is unfit, right? Sounds, good lesson here. Sometimes things just sound like they make sense, that, well, if you slaughter Pesach not for its sake, but not on Pesach, it is fit because you can turn it into a peace offering. Then a peace offering that you slaughtered for the sake of a Pesach should be fit. and then you can argue whether that's on Pesach or not on Pesach, and you could make it sound right. We see this all the time, right? People making political arguments, religious arguments, just arguments at work where, the facts that they're lining up to prove their point sounds like, A plus B plus C leads to D. And then when you think about it, like, no, that doesn't actually work, right? And so that's what he's saying here. So Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, if, as you maintain, other offerings slaughtered on Erev Pesach for the sake of a Pesach are disqualified, you have diminished the force of the requirement that a Pesach be sacrificed for its own sake. And you have given more force to the requirement that a Shalomim, a peace offering, be sacrificed for its own sake. A Pesach sacrificed at the proper time, meaning during the rest of the year, for the sake of a peace offering, is fit. Right? A Pesach that you slaughter as a Pesach, not on Erev Pesach, unfit. A Pesach that you slaughter as something other than a Pesach, like a Shlamim, a peace offering, if it's not on Pesach, is fit. Right? That's what it means during its proper time. A Pesach sacrifice during the rest of the year for the sake of a Shalamim is fit, whereas a Shalamim sacrificed on Erev Pesach for the sake of a Pesach is unfit. The Baraisa continues. Rabbi Eliezer then presented a different logical inference. We find that a leftover Pesach, right, an animal designated to be a Pesach, and for whatever reason you didn't slaughter it on Pesach, that's a leftover Pesach, is brought as a peace offering, as a shalamim, but a leftover shalamim that one bought with money left over from funds that were dedicated toward the acquisition of shalamims is not brought as a Pesach. A Pesach is a potential shalamim, but a shalamim is not a potential Pesach. An animal that you designated to be a peace offering, you can't redesignate it as a Pesach. You can rededicate a Pesach as a Shalamim. It doesn't work in reverse. And if so, one may infer Kal V'chomer, just as with regard to a Pesach whose leftover offering is brought as a Shalamim, and nevertheless, if one slaughtered it at its designated time for the sake of a Shalamim as a Pesach during the rest of the year, it is unfit. I'm sorry. You can't call a Pesach a Shalamim if you slaughter it on Erev Pesach. That would make it unfit. So too, with regard to a peace offering whose leftover offering is not brought, it cannot be brought as a Pesach. If one slaughtered it for the sake of a Pesach at its designated time, isn't it logical that it should be unfit? And Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, actually, this inference is not valid. As we find that a leftover sin offering, for example, one bought with money left over from the funds dedicated to the acquisition of a sin offering, is brought as a burnt offering, right? An olah, an elevation offering. Whereas a leftover burnt offering is not brought as a sin offering. So the fact that one kind of offering, A can become B, doesn't mean that B can become A. We are in 11b. And according to Rabbi Eliezer's logic, one should derive Kal V'chomer just as with regard to a sin offering whose leftover is brought as a burnt offering. Nevertheless, if one slaughtered it for the sake of a burnt offering, it is unfit. So too, with regard to a burnt offering whose leftover is not brought as a sin offering, if one slaughtered it for the sake of a sin offering, isn't it logical that it should be unfit? Yet, the law is that a burnt offering slaughtered for the sake of a sin offering is fit. Right? A sin offering, if at the time you slaughtered it, you had in mind that was anything other than a sin offering, unfit. Not only doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner, but stops the procedure dead. You can't bring it even as a gift offering. But a burnt offering, that at the time you slaughter it, you had in mind that it should be a sin offering, mistakenly, won't fulfill the obligation of its owner, but it can continue its journey to the altar, and it gives the owner merit for bringing a gift offering. We let it complete its journey. Again, we have this lack of parallelism or lack of the mirror image. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, no, if you said that this is the law with regard to a sin offering, that another offering sacrificed for its sake is fit, this is only because a sin offering is fit when sacrificed for its sake all year long. But shall you also say that this is the law with regard to a Pesach, which is fit when sacrificed for its own sake only on Erev Pesach, or Erev Pesach Sheni? Since a Pesach is unfit when sacrificed for its sake during the rest of the year, it is logical that other offerings should be disqualified when sacrificed for its sake at its designated time. Now, the Mishnah teaches, Shimon, the brother of Azariah, says that this is the distinction. With regard to all offerings, if one slaughtered them for the sake of an offering whose sanctity is greater than theirs, they are fit. If one slaughtered them for the sake of an offering whose sanctity is less than theirs, they are unfit. He's trying to establish a kind of logical principle that, okay, if at the time that you made your mistake, slaughtering the animal for the sake of an offering that it was not the actual intended offering. Okay, but if the mistake that you made was slaughtering it for the sake of an offering of higher sanctity than the one you were bringing, it would remain fit. And if you made a mistake and slaughtered for the sake of an offering of lower sanctity, lesser sanctity, then it would be unfit. Now, does that square with what we've already learned? If you were bringing a sin offering and you imagine anything else, higher or lower, unfit. Whereas burnt offering, if you imagine anything else, remains fit. So that doesn't seem to square with this principle of Shimon, the brother of Azariah. So let's see what happens. Rav Ashi teaches in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and Rav Acha, the son of Rava, teaches the same statement in the name of Rabbi Yanai. What is the reason for the opinion of Shimon, the brother of Azariah? Well, it is derived from that which the verse states, and they shall not profane the holy things of the children of Israel, which they will set apart, yarimu, unto the Lord. Leviticus 22:15. So the verse is interpreted not as a prohibition, but rather as a halachic axiom, a principle that you can use to help remember what's going to happen in these cases of error. Teaching that offerings are not profaned, i.e. disqualified, by sacrifice for the sake of offerings whose sanctity is more elevated than theirs, muram. They are profaned only by sacrifice for the sake of offerings whose sanctity is less than theirs. This would square with our general principle that in matters of sanctity, we elevate or ascend rather than descend. The Gemara asks, and does that verse come to teach this law? But is it necessary for a totally different law? A derivation brought by Shmuel. As Shmuel says, from where is it derived that one who eats untithed produce is liable to be punished with death at the hand of heaven? Chorus. As it is stated, quote, and they shall not profane the holy things of the children of Israel, which they shall set apart unto the Lord. So the term will set apart indicates that the verse is speaking of holy items that are set apart in the future. What is that? Untithed produce. Produce from which the tithe has not yet been removed, which includes the portion designated for the priest, the teruma. It will be consecrated and elevated when you take that first 2% of the produce and give it to a priest. That's going to render it edible by you. You also have to make this the tithe, the meiser, for the Levite and the meiser sheni, and only then that produce becomes edible. But here what we're saying is, well, holy things set apart for the Lord. It's not talking about animal offerings, sin offerings, and burnt offerings. It's talking about tithing. So the Gemara asks, and does the verse about teruma? So the Gemara answers, well, if so, if that verse taught only one halacha, the halacha of Shimon, the brother of Azariah, it should have written, which they have set apart. What is the reason that the verse states, which they will set apart in the future tense? Conclude from it that that verse is available to teach two halachas. Number one, that an offering sacrificed for the sake of an offering of greater sanctity is fit, and consumption of untithed produce is punishable by karas. Rabbi Zera raised a dilemma. According to Shimon, the brother of Azariah, who says that less sacred offerings, sacrificed for the sake of more sacred offerings, would remain fit, again, won't satisfy the obligation of the person bringing them, but will remain fit to continue their journey and be categorized as gift offerings. Well, perhaps they are fit, but they do not propitiate God, what I just said. If so, and that is what the rabbis hold. So if so, when Shimon, the brother of Azariah, disagrees with the first Tana in the Mishnah, he disagrees only with regard to one matter, i.e. that more sacred offerings sacrificed for the sake of less sacred ones are disqualified altogether. Alternatively, perhaps Shimon, the brother of Azariah, holds that if less sacred offerings are sacrificed for the sake of more sacred offerings, they are both fit and propitiate. Meaning, no, they remain fit, and actually they will still count as what the offering was supposed to be in the first place. They will fulfill the obligation of the owner, and therefore it means that he disagrees with the rabbis about two things. Abaye and some say Rabbi Zarika said, come in here, proof that they do not satisfy the owner's obligation. Shimon, the brother of Azariah, elaborated on his opinion in the Mishnah. A firstborn animal and the animal tithe that one slaughtered for the sake of peace offerings are fit, as the sanctity of peace offerings is greater. Peace offerings that one slaughtered for the sake of a bechor, a firstborn animal, or for the sake of the animal tithe, are unfit because the error that was made was you had in mind an offering of lesser sanctity. And if it enters your mind that offerings sacrificed for the sake of offerings of greater sanctity are not only fit, but also fulfill the obligation of the owner, i.e. that they propitiate, is a firstborn an offering that propitiates? Do you have to bring a firstborn as an atonement? No, you don't. Sacrificing a firstborn does not serve to propitiate God. Rather, conclude that such offerings are fit but do not propitiate. And one can infer that since in the latter clause they are fit but do not propitiate, in the former clause as well, concerning all offerings of lesser sanctity slaughtered for the sake of offerings of the most sacred order, they are fit, but they do not propitiate. The Gemara responds, well, okay, you've arrived at the halacha that we're talking about, but how you got there doesn't make sense. Are the cases comparable? This case is as it is, and that case is as it is. Perhaps Shimon, the brother of Azariah, holds that offerings of lesser sanctity slaughtered for the sake of offerings of the most sacred order propitiate, but a firstborn animal and an animal tithe slaughtered for the sake of peace offerings do not propitiate. So the Gemara asks, rather, what is the latter clause concerning a firstborn and an animal tithe teaching us? If not, that no offerings of lesser sanctity propitiate God when sacrificed for the sake of offerings of greater sanctity? How is the clause not redundant? Does it teach us an example of offerings of higher sanctity and offerings of lower sanctity? We already learned such an example in the former clause, which teaches, how so? Offerings of the most sacred order that one slaughtered for the sake of offerings of lesser sanctity are unfit. Offerings of lesser sanctity slaughtered for the sake of offerings of the most sacred order are fit. We've already established that. So the Gemara answers, it is stated, lest you say, that the law of offerings of higher sanctity and offerings of lower sanctity applies only when the difference between offerings of the most sacred order and offerings of lesser sanctity. But with regard to offerings of lesser sanctity and other offerings of lesser sanctity, then this law does not apply, as they are all considered to possess the same level of sanctity. Therefore, the Mishnah adds, the example of a firstborn animal and animal tithes slaughtered for the sake of peace offerings to clarify that one can distinguish between different levels of offerings of the category offerings of lesser sanctity. The Gemara raises an objection to this answer. We already learned that as well in another Mishnah on page 89a. The peace offering precedes sacrifice of the firstborn because the peace offering requires placement of its blood twice so as to be visible on four sides of the altar, placing hands on the head of the offering, libations, and waving of the breast and thigh by the priest and the owner, none of which is required when you bring a bechor, a firstborn. So the Gemara answers, the primary mention of the distinction is in this Mishnah. That Mishnah cites it incidentally in discussing the order of precedence of offerings. And with that, we conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 1. Bottom line, if at the time of slaughtering an offering, you had in mind a different kind of offer, a different offering or a different owner for every kind of offering except a sin offering or a Pesach, it's disqualified, meaning it doesn't propitiate, it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner, but it remains fit as a gift offering, completes its journey to the altar. In the case of a sin offering or of a Pesach, if at the time of slaughter you had the wrong kind of offering or owner in mind, disqualified and unfit. That's the law. Now we move on to Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 1. With regard to the Pesach, that one slaughtered on the morning of the 14th of Nisan. When do we slaughter the Pesach? On the afternoon of the 14th. Literally, afternoon. Right? So on the afternoon before Pesach begins that night we eat the Pesach. In the afternoon is the time of slaughtering the Pesach. So if you just take a moment, thousands, maybe millions of people go up to Jerusalem on Pesach, right? On Passover. They set up camp. They set up an area where they're going to eat their meal together. One of the members, we learned all this in Tractate Pesachim, one of the members of the group takes the lamb or the kid goat to the holy temple, and there they are all slaughtered on the afternoon of Pesach, and then the person brings it back to his group and they roast it and eat it that night. But all those lambs and kids have to be slaughtered in this discrete time period, the afternoon of Erev Pesach. So it was said that, on that afternoon, the floor of the temple was very bloody, a lot of blood, because they all had to be slaughtered in that unique time period. So now this Mishnah is asking, okay, well, what if you did it on that day, during that daylight, but before noon? Then what? With regard to the Pesach that one slaughtered on the morning of the 14th of Nisan, if he did so not for its sake, right? You made a mistake or you just redesignated it as a shalamim, okay, that's going to work. If you did it not for its sake, Rabbi Yehoshua deems it fit as though it were slaughtered on the 13th of Nisan, just any other day of the year. An animal consecrated as a Pesach that was slaughtered not at its designated time for the sake of a different offering is fit for sacrifice as a peace offering. Ben Beseira deems it unfit as though it were slaughtered on the afternoon of the 14th. Ben Beseira is saying if you slaughtered that morning as a shalamim, it's like you slaughtered a Pesach as a shalamim in the afternoon. Right? When it was a Pesach and it should have been slaughtered as a Pesach, you slaughtered it for the sake of something else, a shalamim, unfit. Right? So that is how they're going to deal with the problem of the morning. Are we going to compare it to the same day or are we going to compare it to a different day of the year? Right? Yehoshua compares it to a different day of the year. Ben Beseira compares it to in its time, in the afternoon. Shimon ben Azai said, I received the tradition from 72 elders. Where do we have 72 elders? Sanhedrin, when the temple was standing, 71 elders. Where do we have 72 elders? In Yavne. After the temple was destroyed and the Sanhedrin moved to Yavne, kind of reestablished the yeshiva and the Sanhedrin there. Why 72? The 71 members of the Sanhedrin plus the Nasi makes 72. Or plus the president of the Sanhedrin. Maybe that's not the Nasi. I'm not sure about that. But at any rate, he says 72 elders. As the Sanhedrin deliberated and decided on that day that they installed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah at the head of the yeshiva and ruled that all slaughtered offerings that are eaten that were slaughtered not for their sake are fit, but these offerings did not satisfy the obligation of the owner except for the Pesach and the sin offering. Based on that version, Ben Azai added to the law cited in the first Mishnah only the burnt offering, which is not eaten, and the rabbis disagreed and did not concede to him. Right? What was the day that Elazar ben Azariah was elevated? Right? That was when Rabban Gamliel was demoted because of the incident with Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who had an argument about which was the day of Rosh Hashanah and which was the day of Yom Kippur. That's a story for another day, right? But it's interesting, right? They're in Yavne, the temple has been destroyed, and offerings haven't been brought. But they're issuing rulings, right, on what is qualified and what is not qualified. When are these rulings going to be practically used? presumably when the third temple is built. They were people who lived in a generation where they knew people who were there, or they themselves had been there when the temple was destroyed, or was shortly afterward. I'm not sure how many years later was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, but he was definitely a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva saw the temple destroyed. I think Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he was very young, so I'm not sure if he did. Let's read that again. So Shimon ben Azai said, I received the tradition from the 72 elders as the Sanhedrin deliberated and decided on the day that they installed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah at the head of the yeshiva, and they ruled that all slaughtered offerings that are eaten, that were slaughtered not for their sake, are fit. That's what we learned, right, in the first Mishnah, except for the sin offering and the Pesach. But these offerings did not satisfy the obligation of the owner, right? We learned that too, except for the Pesach and the sin offering. So based on that version, Ben Azai added to the law cited in the first Mishnah only the burnt offering, which is not eaten, and the rabbis disagreed and did not concede to him, right? So he would have said that a burnt offering slaughtered not for its sake would be unfit, meaning even though it's not eaten, we don't sprinkle its blood and it doesn't count as a gift offering, but the rabbis did not concede to him. They overruled him on that. Okay, that was the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. Rabbi Elazar says that Rabbi Oshaya says with regard to a Pesach that one slaughtered on the morning of the 14th of Nisan for its sake, Ben Beseira would deem it fit, as he held that the entire day, not only the afternoon, is its designated time, right? So now we're doing the other side of this coin. They were talking about how it would be rendered unfit. But Ben Beseira would say that if you slaughtered a Pesach in the morning, sounds like lechatchila, in the first place, you shouldn't do that, but bediavad, after the fact, it would not be rendered unfit, even though the afternoon is the correct time. If you did it in the morning, it's still fit. Why? Because you did it on the day, Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach is all day, right? Like Friday morning is still Erev Shabbos, just like Friday afternoon is Erev Shabbos. So he would say that a Pesach that you slaughtered as a Pesach on the morning of the 14th is still a Pesach that you can eat, and it fulfills your obligation. You just didn't do it in the ideal way. The Gemara asks, and what is the reason the Mishnah states that according to Ben Beseira, Pesach slaughtered on the morning of the 14th is considered as though it were slaughtered in the afternoon? This language seems to indicate that it does not have the same status as a Pesach that is actually slaughtered in the afternoon. And the Gemara responds, since Rabbi Yehoshua says the term as though it were slaughtered on the 13th, right, a different day altogether, Ben Beseira also uses the term as though it were slaughtered in the afternoon. He's using a grammatical parallel. He's not using that to teach a different law. He's just saying, no, it's the same as slaughtering in the afternoon. But in fact, he maintains there is no difference between a Pesach slaughtered in the morning of the 14th and one slaughtered in the afternoon. So the Gemara asks, if so, rather than disagreeing in the Mishnah with regard to the Pesach that was slaughtered on the morning of the 14th not for its sake, let them just disagree with regard to one slaughtered for its sake. Why are they, right? Why not address the primary case? If you slaughtered a Pesach for the sake of a Pesach on the morning of the 14th, Ben Beseira says it's fit, and apparently Rabbi Yehoshua would say not fit. Why are they talking about a Pesach that was slaughtered not for the sake of a Pesach on the morning of the 14th? Why are we talking about that, less direct case? So the Gemara responds. So the Gemara answers, if the Mishnah were to write only that they disagree with regard to a Pesach that was slaughtered for the sake of a Pesach, I would say, but in a case where it was slaughtered not for its sake, Rabbi Yehoshua would concede to Ben Beseira that it is disqualified, even though it was slaughtered in the morning, since at least part of the day, the afternoon, is fit for its sacrifice as a Pesach. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that they disagree with regard to this case as well. And the Gemara asks, how can Ben Beseira claim that a Pesach may be slaughtered in the morning? Where's he getting that? But isn't it written, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon? Bein ha'arbayim, Exodus 12:6, right? If we're translating Ben ha'arbayim, and standard translation is in the afternoon, the Torah says slaughter it in the afternoon. How can Ben Beseira say it's okay to slaughter it in the morning? Ula, the son of Rav Ilay, says Ben Beseira interprets the phrase Ben Ha'arbayim literally, right? Just what do we call the evening service? Ma'ariv, right? Ariv, like Aravit, right? In Israeli, Hebrew or Sephardim would say Aravit. So the word Arbaim is related to evening. So actually, it doesn't mean in the afternoon. It means between two evenings, i.e. between the eve of the 14th and the night of the 14th. So accordingly, the Pesach may be sacrificed all day long, according to Ben Beseira. And the Gemara asks, if so, then with regard to the daily offering, which is brought every day, concerning which it is also written in the Torah, the one lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer ben ha'arbayim, in the afternoon, right? The daily offerings brought in the Holy Temple every day, there was one in the morning and one in the afternoon. These have been replaced by the morning prayer service and the afternoon prayer service, Shachris and Mincha. So wasn't the Torah being quite specific? Morning and afternoon. How can you translate Ben Harbaim as afternoon when it comes to the daily offering, but all day long when it comes to the time of bringing the Pesach? I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And the Gemara answers, there, since it is written, the one lamb you shall offer in the morning, by inference, the term Ben Harbaim has to be referring to the actual afternoon. Are we going to say the same in a verse where it doesn't specify that it means afternoon versus morning? The Gemara counters say that one of the lambs should be sacrificed in the morning, and the other one could be sacrificed all day. Why is it evident from the requirement that one can be sacrificed in the morning that the other must be sacrificed in the afternoon? And the Gemara answers, the clause, one lamb you shall offer in the morning, indicates that two lambs are not sacrificed in the morning. The other must perforce be sacrificed in the afternoon. And the Gemara asks, whoa, how can you make that assumption? With regard to the lamps of the menorah, one should say the same as it is written. And when Aaron lights the lamps, Bein ha'arbayim, is the entire day fit for lighting also, according to the opinion of Ben Beseira? And the Gemara answers, well, there it is different, as it is written, to burn from evening to morning, in Exodus 27:21. And it is taught in a Baraisa, the phrase from evening to morning indicates that you must allocate the menorah its measure of oil so that it will burn from evening until morning. Alternatively, the same verse can be interpreted as follows: only this rite is valid from evening until morning, since all other rites that are performed in the Holy Temple were performed during the day. All offerings were brought during the day. The daily offerings were brought during the day. The only thing that was done at night, late afternoon, light the menorah so that the menorah will burn all night long. So the Gemara asks, well, with regard to the incense, one should say likewise, as it is written with regard to it, Bein ha'arbayim, he shall burn it. Is the entire day also fit for burning the incense according to the opinion of Ben Beseira? And the Gemara answers, the incense is different, as it is juxtaposed with the lighting of the lamps. So evidently, it is burned in the afternoon as well. We're in the middle of this discussion. We're deriving, how can Ben Beseira say that the Pesach slaughtered in the morning of the 14th is still valid when the Torah seems to clearly indicate that it has to be slaughtered in the afternoon? We'll continue that discussion tomorrow, Sunday, at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. I'll take a few comments. Nina is not available, so I'm just looking for questions. I see that Sharon is in my husband's van with mechanical difficulties and stuck in a gas station waiting for a service vehicle to get us home. Please, God, get Sharon and her husband home safely. And look at the dedication to Torah. She's learning Torah in that situation on a Saturday night at past midnight. You're the most awesomest. Your dedication is incredible. Maybe you be strengthened to learn and teach Torah to 120. Ilanit, I wonder if the sages were imagining the rejection of an offering due to improper intention as from the point of view of heaven, since intent is internal, hidden, and how would it ever be known by others? Right, this is not something like there was, kavana police, an intention police. This is something that a pious person would know, whether he had the correct intent or not. And once he realized he did it with the wrong intent and he wants to know, okay, what do I do now? These are the rulings that he would rely on. All of this is absolutely an internal process known only to the person who had that intent and our Lord in heaven. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, see you tomorrow, Sunday at 6 p.m. Pacific. All the best. Good